Good evening, listeners. It's time to settle in for another chilling story of suburban suspense. From the slumbering heads of Mount Rushmore to the twin and windy cities. From the unseen depths of the Great Lakes to the rustling husks of cornfields across the heartland. Who knows what ghouls and crawling creatures lurk among us under the Midwest moon?
Neon Prowler. The fog that rolled into town wasn't immediately worrying. Most mornings this time of year, it seemed the whole town was wrapped in clouds. It hid the twin spires of the cathedral and filled in all the gaps between tree branches. What was unusual about this fog was how it didn't lift. 2 full days of near zero visibility, and no one could quite believe it. By the third morning, the weatherman on the local news replaced the state weather map with a screenshot of John Carpenter's eerie movie, Just More Fog Today, he laughed. The fog was accompanied by light pillars, beams of light that reflect off ice crystals in the air. The sky looked like the cover of an 80s synth album with bright bands of neon light rising straight up from the ground. Yellow, white, and lavender streaks from street lamps and glowing signs pierced the fog like a meteor shower in reverse. Marcus didn't mind the fog. He preferred it over a late winter blizzard, which was the likely alternative. He even preferred the fog over straight sunshine, since he was stuck inside anyway. Marcus was the only one of his friends with an after-school job. The group would say their goodbyes to Marcus beside the bike rack after last period before racing off to John's basement or the woods behind Brady's house, leaving Marcus to pull his apron from his backpack and slump toward the grocery store. Marcus spent every moment outside of school stocking and bagging groceries in his uncle's shop, and jealousy tightened in his chest like a clenched fist when he thought of missing out on something exciting while he disinfected carts or shelved tortilla chips and bean dip. Tonight, in the foggy haze, the bare trees beside the grocery store absorbed the glow of the store's sign, their pink limbs reaching like jagged lightning bolts into the night. Marcus looked around the empty parking lot, swallowed up by fog. He loved how the fog obscured everything, like a camera lens that clouds over in the cold. Not 20 minutes after Marcus clocked in and started inventory, his friend John called to tell him the guys were on their way to pull out their go-karts. In this weather, he asked? Yeah, no one's driving. We'll have the streets to ourselves. Marcus's other friends shouted and taunted him in the background of the call, and he wrestled with what to do. The store was dead. He couldn't imagine it pick up much in the next hour, and the carts had sat untouched since last summer. He felt a pang of guilt, but it passed quickly as he hit the lights and unplugged the open sign from the front window. After locking the front door and pulling the handle twice for reassurance, he raced off to meet his friends. Everyone met up at John's shed to pick up the go-karts and wheeled them through the alley to the smooth, main level drag nearby, where they climbed in. Marcus could barely fit in the cart with his puffy winter coat, but he wedged himself tightly into the seat, stretching his legs straight out ahead of him and grabbing the steering wheel above his knees. The group tossed each other helmets and tore down the street in a burst of hollers and excited whoops. Ice lined every curb, and the slush on the streets had melted into long puddles that reflected the city's neon lights. A rainbow constellation spread across the black asphalt. The cold made Marcus's eyes tear up, but the speed was a rush. The subtle rumble of the engine resonated in his sternum, and he felt every shift and groove in the road with his whole body. Lights made strange halos in the fog. The city felt like a surreal dream world, everything softened and hazy. Marcus looked up to see the fog seem to drape from the orange street lights racing past and thought of a poem from Mr. Okerlund's class, of fog hanging like old coats between trees. He was still in the daydream, trying to recall how the poem ended, while a white flash bolted across his vision. A shock of bright fur, Startled, Marcus wrenched the steering wheel away from the electric streak and crashed into a street lamp, flipping the cart onto its side. His helmet hit the pavement and the go-kart's fiberglass frame cracked on impact. His friends raced over to him in an instant. The group pulled him from the overturned cart and lifted him by the arms to stand beside him. They asked in a jumble of voices if he was okay. Did he hurt anything? His neck ached, and his jacket was torn and ragged where his shoulder had slid along concrete, but he wasn't thinking about any of that. He was stuck on what he'd seen that made him wreck. The fog-colored wolf sprinting beside him. Had no one else seen it? Marcus scanned the streets and buildings in all directions, searching for a husky or maybe a wild animal that had ventured too far into town because of the fog. But thick mist pressed in on the boys and hid the world beyond their huddle. Marcus shivered and shook off the thought. He liked these guys, but they weren't close enough for him to freak out about what he saw. He wasn't certain about it himself anyway, so he tucked his panic up and pocketed it like a secret. Then he jumped in to help the others pick up splintered fiberglass from the road and roll the totaled go-kart back to John's shed. The group called it a night, and Marcus headed back to the store, feeling more and more sore and torn up with each step of the icy walk. He cradled his arm against his chest, suddenly afraid of how tender his shoulder was, praying some Aleve and heat would keep him from the emergency room. When he reached the store's block, he could barely make out its bright sign through the haze. Marcus slogged the length of the parking lot before he was close enough for the fog to fall away. He stopped short just feet from the front door. It was open. An intruder. Marcus' first impulse was to call 911 in case someone was still inside, but guilt stilled him. Whatever happened to the store on his watch was his fault. Shame dressed as bravery took over, and he thought maybe he could handle the situation himself without anyone having to know he'd cut out. Slowly, Marcus stepped in to find the store unnervingly still. Of course, that was always the case when he worked a solo shift, but this time it felt suspect. Echoey oldies played over the sound system, soulful crooning to an empty store. Half terrified, Marcus strode the aisle slowly, holding up his keychain pepper spray the size of his inhaler and praying he wouldn't need it. He passed the produce aisle and the paper goods, the snack aisle and all the rest, each one clear until he reached the last aisle, the frozen food section at the back of the store. A case at the far end was ajar. Boxes of soft pretzels and frozen pizza spilled out of the door, jamming it open. Inside, the fluorescent tube light flickered over torn-apart bags of hash browns and vegetables. There was a violent streak across the condensation on the glass window. Cautiously, he stepped closer to see what was a handprint on the icy door, the fingers long and pointed. He spun around, suddenly spooked, but the aisle behind him was clear. He took a shaky breath as he wiped his palms on his apron. Marcus retraced his sweep of the store, speeding past each aisle a second time and peering under each checkout counter before ducking back into the stockroom and office, finding them all empty. Still on edge, Marcus set to work cleaning the mess. He straightened a fallen cardboard display stand and examined the mess of frozen food packages, tossing any that had been ripped open. So strange that nothing had been stolen, he thought. Luckily, there wasn't any damage to the store itself, but enough items had been destroyed that he couldn't make up the loss with his own money. He would have to fess up. When Marcus got home that night, he found his dad sitting in the dim living room, his face glowing blue from the nightly news. The moment he saw his son's expression, Marcus's dad muted the TV and leaned forward in his chair. "What is it?" Marcus had never kept so much as a playground fib from his dad, and he spooled out the whole night. The go-karts and the crash and the damaged groceries. He started to tell him about the wolf, too, but his voice caught. He left it, letting his dad think the crash was because of recklessness. His dad was surprisingly calm about the whole confession. He cursed his brother for never installing security cameras, but more than anything, he was relieved that Marcus hadn't gotten hurt. He also knew his son well. The guilt alone would make him fly right from here on out. No need for punishment. It was Marcus's uncle who had the strong reaction. The next morning, when Marcus stopped by the store and explained what he'd found, the slashed bags of food and the sharp-fingered smear of a handprint, a shadow passed over his uncle's face. Marcus saw the man's grip on the checkout counter tighten. After an impossibly long silence, in a softer voice than Marcus had ever heard from his uncle, The man told him he had experienced a nearly identical incident at the store when he was Marcus's age. The town had been under a severe fog advisory then, too. He was working a quiet shift and feeling lousy about missing out on a pinball tournament, he said. After sulking about it, resenting every customer who passed through in his line that night, he started to feel angry and decided to take money from the register for the pinball machines. I remember the quarters feeling hot in my pocket, and my stomach was queasy immediately. But I was so determined, he said. When closing time came that night years back, Marcus's uncle grabbed his jacket and gloves from the stockroom and made for the front of the store. A quick glance down the frozen aisle stopped him cold. There, between the bright, humming cases, stood a hulking wolf on its hind legs. It looked electric, like neon radiated from its body, Marcus's uncle said. I was paralyzed with fear, just looking into its face as it studied me. I don't know how long we both stood like that, staring at each other, before my adrenaline kicked in and I ran to hide in the office. I heard a clatter and the front door slam open against the wall, and when I crept back out, the wolf was gone. I remember just standing in the empty aisle afterward, trying to work out whether it had been real. Marcus stood silent, stunned by his uncle's openness and chilled by how closely his uncle's story reflected his own. People thought I was bored and made it up, his uncle said. They shrugged it off. But I was terrified. Was that it? Was that the last you saw it? Marcus asked. His uncle shifted. Actually, no. Marcus had never seen his uncle like this. He suddenly pictured the man as a teenager, sweating outside the principal's office. After a long moment, his uncle told him about seeing the wolf again when he and his friends were out in the woods behind the high school. His friends were hazing a new teammate after basketball practice, making him run sprints through the trees blindfolded. Marcus's uncle wasn't a part of the prank, but he had felt so ashamed for watching it happen, for not intervening. I was standing a ways back behind a tree, anxious for the whole thing to be over and to go home, when I heard a branch snap beside me. I thought it was a teacher or a coach, but when I turned, it was the electric wolf. It was on all fours then, and it stared me down with the most intense blue eyes. I tried to yell out, but my voice didn't work. The wolf just stayed there, panting, before it ran off into the fog. I've seen it a half dozen times in the years since, but each time was such a quick, hidden glimpse, always in overcast weather, and I've never been sure. For a long time, Marcus's uncle wondered why he was alone in seeing the monster. The only answer he could come up with was that everyone else had been lulled by the foggy haze, a winter daze that hung over the city and blinded them to the wolf. Marcus was overwhelmed then with the need to confess what he'd seen. In a breathless surge, Marcus unloaded his whole experience on his uncle, the fur and the brightness, the speed that had shocked him into crashing. He said it all with eyes tightly shut, making sharp gestures with his hands to convey the animal's quickness and closeness. When he'd finished, he looked finally at his uncle, who swallowed hard. It was like it came out of nowhere, Marcus said, just appeared out of the fog. That was when Marcus's uncle looked covertly over his shoulder to make sure no one was near and told Marcus in a hushed voice that he had a crazy theory about that. I have this feeling, he said, that the frozen isle is some kind of portal, like a passage to another place completely. The wolf came through the door of that back case. I'm sure of it. And it sounds like the same thing happened to you. Marcus didn't know what to do with that. The boy and his uncle shared a terrified silence for several moments before Marcus realized he was late for school. He thanked his uncle abruptly and raced off, his shoulders feeling 20 pounds heavier. Marcus ghost-walked through the school day, his mind too full of wolves and what-ifs to take in anything. That afternoon, when he reported to the store for another solo shift, Marcus set up a stool facing the frozen aisle door that had spilled open. He would catch the wolf. Coming or going, he didn't know, but he'd be there when it returned. Hours passed with Marcus on his post. He left his seat only to help the trickle of customers who stopped by, always hurrying back to his lookout. But the wolf didn't show. Nothing happened the rest of the week either, but Marcus kept up the stakeout. 3 more nights of fog, 3 more shifts spent watching the door. Late one night, it occurred to Marcus that the wolf had come when he was misbehaving. The same was true for his uncle. That had been so unlike his uncle to act out, Marcus thought. He had only known the man to be straight-laced, a textbook rule follower. But now, Marcus wondered if his uncle was that way because of the wolf. Had that been what made the man so well behaved his whole life? The threat of the wolf, always watching for missteps? Marcus couldn't say, but he did know that he was not his uncle. He would deal with the wolf in his own way. When the last customer of the night had been seen out, Marcus reached behind the front checkout stand for a cigar. He tore its wrapping open and found a matchbook in the office. Marcus lit the cigar then, the tip slowly smoking, and held it up, broadcasting his bad behavior. The cigar smoked for just a minute before Marcus's asthma acted up. He started wheezing and couldn't help but cough. No matter how far away from himself he held the cigar. Suddenly embarrassed by his idea to lure the wolf, Marcus stamped out the cigar and tossed it into the trash. He leaned down behind the counter to push the cigar to the bottom of the bin, hiding it under other trash. When he stood back up, he saw the creature straight ahead in the freezer aisle lights. A white wolf, glowing electric. Slowly, Marcus circled to the front of the counter, closer to the wolf, who stared at him intently with frosty blue eyes. Suddenly, with no warning, the wolf dropped to all fours and sprinted full speed at Marcus. The creature's muscles tensed with each stride. It covered the distance to Marcus in no time, and when the wolf's face came within inches of Marcus, the creature launched over him in a long, clean stride. The wolf slammed against the store's front door, forcing it open, and bounded outside. Breathless, Marcus scrambled after the wolf. He made it just outside the door before stopping dead. The wolf stood in the empty parking lot beneath the grocery store sign. His back was turned to the boy, shoulders heaving with its ragged breaths. The pink neon light shone off its fur reflective like fog. Still on two legs, the wolf stalked into the foggy night, instantly disappearing in the haze.